So here's the part two of the video of interfaces and abstract classes. Now let's try to understand some key concepts from the interface perspective. The first important concept from interface perspective is that interface cannot have implemented functions and methods. So what I'll do is that I'll start ticking these things and I'll show you practically how these things are actually seen in the C# code. The first important point to remember is that interfaces cannot have implemented functions. So if you go and if you try to type here an implementation, let's say that you try to give an implementation to this, and if you try to compile this code, it will throw up an error saying that interface members cannot have definitions. So that's the first important point to remember, that interface cannot have definitions, or interface cannot have implementation code in the functions, methods, or events. So that's the first important point to remember about interfaces. The second important point to remember about interfaces is that all the methods in an interface which is defined needs to be implemented. So in other words, if you do not define an interface, if you do not implement an interface here, for example, here I have an interface called as IDB, and here's a class called as CLS SQL Server, and CLS SQL Server is basically implementing the IDB interface, and I have not provided any implementation for update over here, then this will throw up an exception saying that you need to implement this function or the method. So it's saying that CLS SQL Server does not implement interface member update. So that's the second point to remember, that every method in an interface needs to be implemented by the child classes. The next important point to remember is that all interfaces methods are public. So in other words, let's say that we have a method here called as void update, and if you try to define this method as public, and if you try to compile this code, you will be thrown up exception saying that the modifier public is not valid for this item. So in other words, you cannot define an access modifier on the interface methods. By default, they are public. In other words, if you try to define this as private, it will again throw up an error. So you do not need to define private, public, protected, or any kind of access modifiers on the interface methods, events, or functions, or properties. By default, all the methods of interfaces are public. So that's the third point to remember. Now there are two more important points here, and I'm not going to show you a practical over here on this. The fourth important point is that you can implement multiple interfaces. So for example, you can have interface 1 and interface 2, and your class can implement both of these interfaces. That's a fourth important point. And the fifth and the last important point is that you can implement polymorphism using interfaces. We have already seen some examples of polymorphism in our polymorphism lecture. So you can do the same thing by using interfaces. So you can have a parent interface class, and you can use that interface class to point towards any of these child classes. So in all, there are 5 important points you need to remember about interfaces. First, you cannot implement, or you cannot provide implementation in functions and methods. Second, all the methods in an interface needs to be implemented by the concrete classes. Third, you cannot define any kind of access modifiers on the interface methods. By default, they are public. Fourth point, you can implement multiple interfaces. So for example, you can have interface 1, interface 2, and you can implement both these interfaces on a single class. And the final point is that you can achieve polymorphism by using interfaces. Now let's go to the next section, and let's try to discuss about what's the difference between interfaces and abstract classes. There are 4 important differences between interfaces and abstract class. The first thing is that abstract classes can have abstract members, as well as it can have a normal .NET method or a function, that is the non-abstract method. But in interfaces, all functions and methods are by default abstract. So if you remember the abstract class which we discussed previously, let me just open the abstract class. So in abstract class, if you remember, we can have an abstract function or abstract method, and we can have non-abstract method as well. But in interface, you can only have abstract methods or abstract methods and abstract functions. So you cannot have a combination of a non-abstract as well as abstract method in interfaces. So that's the first big difference between abstract classes and interfaces. The second big difference is that interfaces do not have any implementation, while abstract classes can have implementation. So if you remember, in our previous video of abstract classes, we had some implementation, but in interfaces we cannot define any kind of implementation. So that's the second difference between abstract classes and interfaces. The third important point to be remembered about abstract classes and interfaces difference is that abstract classes can add more functionality without destroying the child classes. While in interfaces, if whenever you add a function or whenever you add a method, you need to implement them in your child classes. So that's the third most important difference. The final one, it's not a difference as such, but if you define your abstract class as if you define an abstract class with abstract methods, it will have the same effect as the interface. So if you have an abstract class which has only abstract methods, the effect will be same as defining an interface. So these are four important points to be remembered from the differentiation perspective of interfaces and abstract class. Now, said and done that, the most important difference between interfaces and abstract class is from the implementation perspective. The scenario in which you're going to use both of these classes. Now, if you have a requirement where you want to bring in uniformity, or where you want to bring in a standardization across your classes naming convention, then you can use interfaces. If you have a requirement where you want to decouple two classes, then you need to use interfaces. So interfaces are used when you want to decouple classes, or when you want to make a decoupled system, and second, when you want to enforce some kind of rules and regulations across your classes, like the method naming conventions or the event naming conventions. While abstract classes are used to define a parent class which cannot be instantiated, and the functionalities of the parent class can be reused by the child class. So if you have a requirement where you want to reuse functionality through inheritance, then you can use the abstract class. So the most important difference between interfaces and abstract class is from the implementation perspective. When you are going to use what? So if you want to do standardization, or if you want to enforce rules across your classes, or when you want to decouple two classes, you have to use interfaces. If you want to increase reusability through inheritance, you have to use abstract classes. So both of these things, interfaces and abstract classes, have a very specific use as per the scenarios and as per the requirements. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and in the coming up videos we are going to discuss about delegates, functions, three-tier architecture, etc. So I hope that you are enjoying this object-oriented programming video series, and see you up in the coming up video sections.